This is the Moonlight Graham Show, a freewheeling conversation with the role players, the underdogs, and guys with flat-out great stories in sports.
Hello and welcome back to the Moonlight Graham Show. And our Moonlighter for today is the 11th highest NFL draft pick ever to come out of Iowa State University, the mecca of college football in the Midwest. And of course, I say that jokingly because during the 5 years our Moonlighter played football at Iowa State University, the Cyclones only won 12 total games in 5 years. So there was not a lot of success on the football field at that time as far as wins and losses go. But what that era of college football, and we're talking about the early to mid-90s, what that era of Cyclone football did was pump a lot of excitement into the football program because that was also the era of Troy Davis. Troy Davis, the greatest football player ever to put on the Cardinal and Gold in Ames, Iowa, rushed for 2,000 yards in back-to-back seasons. He's the only Division I running back ever to do that. He was a Heisman finalist 2 years in a row. And of course, a running back cannot have success on his own. He needs a great line in front of him for him to have success. And our Moonlighter for today was the centerpiece of that line. He actually wasn't the centerpiece because he didn't play center, but he was the best lineman on those Troy Davis Iowa State teams. His name is Tim Kohn. And Tim Kohn was a 6'6", 315-pound hulking lineman. And when he put the neck roll on, he looked like he was about 7 feet tall, weighed 400, because of course he had to have the huge 1990s neck roll when he was blocking for Troy Davis. And after Iowa State, Tim Kohn and Troy Davis actually both got drafted into the NFL in the third round. Tim was drafted by Al Davis and the Oakland Raiders at that time. I believe he was 85th overall, the 85th overall draft pick in the 1996 NFL draft. Tim spent a couple of years in the NFL with both the Raiders and the Broncos, and since the NFL, he's had a really successful career in the financial services industry. And that's kind of how I found Tim Kohn. I've been following him on Twitter. He's really into FinTwit, which is financial Twitter. He's a big voice in the FinTwit world, and I think he's a great follow on Twitter. He's not your stereotypical meathead football player. Tim Kohn's a really bright guy. He's really entertaining. He's got lots of great stories, and I think you guys are going to love this interview because not only do we talk about what it's like to block for Troy Davis, to play for Al Davis, but also, some more interesting things like what books he finds interesting, what it's like to have a cheat day meal when you're a 6'6", 315-pound lineman. That's the type of stuff that I want to talk about. And I think you guys are really going to enjoy this. And if you like what we're doing here on the Moonlight Graham Show, make sure to subscribe to the podcast wherever it is that you get your podcast. And we would love it if you left us a 5-star review. You can also follow the show on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube. We love hearing from you guys each and every week. Enjoy today's episode with Moonlighter Tim Kohn. But before we get to our episode, I want to talk to you about a new partner of ours. It's called the Underdog Newsletter. So the Underdog Newsletter is an email newsletter that you can sign up for online. Here's what it is. It's a bite-sized rundown of the best underdog stories in sports. You guys know we're all about the underdogs here on the Moonlight Graham Show. And what these guys do, they sift through thousands of stories each and every week and handpick the best underdog stories and deliver them into your email inbox each and every week. They deliver it the same time the Moonlight Graham Show comes out every Tuesday morning. And these guys over at the Underdog Newsletter, they celebrate the long shots, the rejects, the misfits, beating the odds, and overcoming adversity. I don't know if there's a better email subscription list that you can sign up for than the Underdog Newsletter. Here's how you find them. You head over to www.jokermag.com/newsletter, or to make it even easier, all you have to do is type in Underdog Newsletter into Google, sign up for the Underdog Newsletter. It'll come into your inbox every Tuesday morning, and let them know the Moonlight Graham Show sent you. I guarantee that you'll enjoy this Underdog Newsletter each and every week. Check them out, guys. So sitting down with Tim Kohn, former Iowa State All-American, former NFL draft pick, preseason All-American maybe. You're giving me a look there. And
Tim, I've been following you on Twitter for a while now. And one of my favorite kind of running jokes that you have on Twitter is you travel a lot for work, and you always talk about working out in like the hotel, these hotel, workout rooms, these hotel gyms, which are always full of like really cheap equipment. It's always the same like Cybex gear. And I travel for work a lot too, so I can empathize here. But you're a big man. You're a lot bigger man than me, and so I've read a couple of times that you have broken hotel treadmills. Now, what is your running count up to?
I think it's 19. I do think that it might be higher than 19. I did break my basement treadmill as a result of this whole COVID lockdown thing, and if that was my sole outlet for being able to work out, then the belt gave way, it ripped, and I think the motor was starting to smoke and act funny and leak oil or whatever else. So I got a replacement one there, and thoughts and prayers as to whether or not that one makes it for over a year.
How many weird looks do you get if there's other people in the hotel gym? Because, like I said, you're a big man. I'm guessing a lot of noise is being made on these treadmills.
People can hear from the hallway outside. They hear me literally leaving divots into the belt of the hotel treadmills and things like that. You hear the pound, pound, pound. I mean, I'm not light on my feet. Even though I've lost a fair amount of weight, I'm not near my playing weight. It's still going to be a lot of resounding, echoing pounding. And so I would imagine that it would be a difficult proposition to sidle right up to the treadmill next to me, and especially when I'm also throwing off sweat like I'm some type of lawn sprinkler. But
right. So 19. If you break a treadmill, do you tell the front desk?
I usually do. Yeah, usually. I actually had, I think, one visit where they had 3 treadmills, and I knocked out all 3, and I took pictures of all 3. And I don't know what the maintenance issue is. I really probably should invest a little more time understanding this, but sometimes it's like, hey, cannot get up to speed, and then it just like shuts down and powers down. Sometimes it, just seems to like kind of quit, and all of a sudden the belt dies, and I almost lurch forward, and it's one of those things where I actually brace myself when I run on treadmills. The only place I actually feel remotely like I'm not going to have a calamity is when I'm at like some type of a gym that hopefully has better maintained equipment. But
you see a lot of these linemen nowadays that I think we saw with like Marshall.
Mm-hmm.
How hard was it for you to kind of get out of that playing weight mode when you stopped playing?
Well, the funny thing is, I was one of those super skinny, what they might refer to as an ectomorph. The
I have
rail
no
thin.
idea what ectomorph means.
There's 3 basic body types: ectomorphs, mesomorphs, and endomorphs. And ectomorphs are your ridiculously skinny, can never put on weight, hard gainer type guys. Mesomorphs are kind of like your Adonis. Hey, they can eat whatever they want and they look buff, that type of thing. And endomorphs are the soft guys that can never seem to lose weight. Usually your linemen are endomorphs, but occasionally you get tall mesomorph or ectomorphic guys that are basketball players in a football player's body, and they can when I played at the Raiders, there was one guy I played with, Pat Harlow, who was good offensive tackle, played under Parcells in New England, came over to Oakland. He was about 6'6", 278, and he had to struggle to stay up to 278. But he also never wanted to put on bad weight, so he would eat just chicken breast after chicken breast, anything to keep the weight on. I was actually kind of that way all through high school. I didn't play football till my junior year, and I was a skinny basketball player, really tall, lanky, couldn't do a push-up type of guy.
Couldn't do a push-up?
Oh, gosh, no. I was a total spaz. And my junior year, I got up to about 190, 200 pounds.
At 6'6"? At
6'6". That was buff for me because I was about 150 pounds just a year or two before that. And I got up to the point where I could bench close to my body weight. I could bench 195. I could do maybe 5-6 push-ups, good push-ups if I really forced myself to. I was a total scrub. Basically would play mop-up duty my junior year. Got up to 250 pounds my senior year, lifting weights, just being really diligent, and ended up having a good campaign that allowed me to get interest by the likes of Iowa State, and then got up to 330 pounds by the time I was a pro. But it's hard to lose that weight afterwards.
Okay, so you didn't play football till your junior year of high school, but then all of a sudden you kind of got into lifting right away and really dedicated yourself that senior year. What about football made you want to commit yourself to it? Because, most of the guys that really commit to themselves to it, they loved football from day one, but it sounds like you came to that later.
I loved football, but the problem was I was in a high school in suburban Chicago that was all about basketball. And I was 6'6" as a freshman. All the doctors said that my growth gaps to my knees suggested I was going to be 6'10", so my dad, basketball coaches, everybody saw me as the next Kevin McHale. And they didn't want me to play football because I was also skinny, weak, uncoordinated. They thought I'd get broken like a twig, and they were probably right. By the time I got to the end of my sophomore year, it really occurred to me that I hadn't grown anymore. I'd gained a little bit of weight, but I still wasn't strong, and I always wanted to play football. I always enjoyed playing pickup football, as a tight end, catching the ball downfield, far more than I did actually playing post in basketball. And I had no illusions that at 6'6", I was going to be anybody's star center, and I sure couldn't shoot. I was like Shaquille O'Neal at the free throw line. I was brutal. So, I wasn't going to make any kind of lasting impression there. And I just wanted to do something that was purely fun. So I went out for football, and I never set any kind of unrealistic expectations. I was just there to have fun. And the more I got into it, the more that, lifting weights and swallowing my pride and, starting humbly with ridiculously light weights, that didn't matter to me. What mattered to me was improving. And so I didn't have any pre-built expectations. And then I went to a football camp before my senior year, University of Illinois football camp. And I got, most improved camper. I got, like all these accolades because they never had any kind of a book or a file on me.
Yeah,
and
you weren't on anybody's radar.
And I was absolutely, outperforming all the high profile invitees that they brought in there. So that actually started engendering a little bit of thought that maybe football could be for real. So, that just added fuel to getting prepared. And the only major like Power 5 conference that kept a scholarship available for me, some offered and then rescinded, was Iowa State. So Iowa State, kind of caught on to me late. They saw me play in the playoffs my senior year. I went up against the Illinois State Player of the Year both ways, offense and defense, and I got the better of them on both sides. And all the scouts watching him saw me basically outplay him in every phase. And, a couple schools, wanted to try to find room for me, and then they got, guys higher on their list, I guess. Iowa State was, one that still had a spot. So I actually knew nothing about Iowa State before coming here. I didn't even know they were in the Big 8 conference at the time. I was all Big 10, in my mindset.
What was it about being an offensive lineman? Where actually, I've heard you came into Iowa State as a defensive lineman, actually. But what was it about being an offensive lineman that came naturally to you? Because there had to be things that came naturally because you got really good really quick. You went from not playing football at all to starting at Iowa State as a true freshman. And so... Oh,
no, not as a true freshman. I got my first start as a redshirt freshman.
Okay. I guess I didn't know you redshirted. I knew you started all 4 years, but I didn't know you redshirted. But it had to still come quick because most kids, they're playing football out of the womb, and it came later for you, but you got really good really quick.
A lot of it was, I guess I was blessed in a couple of ways. I started really, really low in terms of speed and strength. I had basically I was on the floor, but I didn't have a great deal of I really didn't have a ceiling. It seemed like every time I made progress, I very seldom plateaued. So I was kind of a good, blank canvas for a lot of coaching. I didn't have a whole lot of bad habits actually starting that late. You could really shape what I was doing. And so as a defensive lineman, I was athletic, but I also thought too much. I had paralysis of analysis. That limited me because in terms of my 40 time, my agility times, my vertical leap, everything else like that, everything would suggest defensive end from an athletic profile standpoint. But I also like to eat. So moving to the offensive line was really a good accommodation for that. I was 250 as a freshman at Iowa State, and man, hey, you got to get up to around 270, 280, to really, hang in there. So, gosh, don't threaten me with a good time. I'm going to go ahead and hit, Country Kitchen Buffet and everything else that, and Great Plains Pizza on a regular basis. That's a plug I don't mind giving because I want that place to stay in business. Every time I go to that place, it's like a time machine for me. So, from that standpoint, offensive line was something where I could actually go through a thought process and anticipate things and, not necessarily have to be so reactive, so reflexive as a defensive player really needs to be. And so that was a better fit for me. Plus, I had good basketball player feet, which made, pass protection and things like that come a little bit more naturally for me.
Yeah, you're Kevin McHale.
Kind of post moves and stuff like that. As long as you're not asking me to run the fast break, I'm able to kind of move in space fairly well, or play a little bit of a match in the mirror defense. But so that was a thing that really the credit me becoming an effective offensive lineman was really a function of Steve Loney coming in under Dan McCarney. And I mean, there were like great people and great coaches under, Coach Walden's staff and great teammates to learn from and be mentored by. But that was the amazing thing, is that into my junior year, I'd been a wishbone, triple option lineman. Nothing that resembles what a pro offensive lineman would do.
Right.
And in 2 years, Steve Loney and Dan McCarney's staff had to essentially reform all of us into a pro set style offense. And Coach Loney had the most work on his hands to make me an effective pass blocker and everything else like that. And that was really clutch for me becoming a pro caliber, such as it was, offensive lineman.
I've had a number of Iowa State football players on the pod, and it seems like Steve Loney's name comes up in every interview with him. What was it about that guy that made him, so endearing to players?
I hope he's listening to this, because he's genuinely just one of the best people that I could have been around at that age, at that stage, and yet I was still in a way terrified and intimidated by him, because he was kind of stern, and he seemed like he'd get disgusted pretty easily when we weren't doing what we were supposed to be doing.
He called you Timothy, too.
Timothy. Yeah. I remember there was one game against UNI, as a matter of fact, where I believe that it was the one game we won against UNI, one time out of 3, where we had one drive where I think we went 93 yards for a touchdown, and there wasn't a single pass play. I think it was like 13 running plays. And I was asked by, I think it was the Des Moines Register, somebody saying, Tim, what was your thought process, during that long drive, just, overpowering UNI's defense? I said, that was really the catharsis of our frustration. I didn't think anything about it. Next day, we're doing the whole, post-game practice and film review. We're stretching out in the field, and I hear Steve Loney coming down, Timothy, what in the hell is a catharsis? I'm like, okay. And I actually got some credit from, I think, the psychology department at Iowa State, saying, hey, a football player used this term, and it was in the right context. Yeah. And no, I think Coach Loney was the one who coined the phrase, when I jumped off sides, I think it was 3 times consecutively, and he pulled me out. I had a really bad cold that caused me to have stuffed up sinuses, and on the plane, my eardrum burst. So I could not hear out of my right eardrum, and that was the ear that was towards the quarterback. So I could not hear the snap count. I jumped off sides 3 times against Oklahoma. Pulled me out of the game, and they're just yelling at me, and I think Coach Loney said, Timothy, you are the dumbest smart guy I've ever met. And that's always been kind of like, that's probably the most apt description that anybody's ever lent to me.
I grew up a Cyclone fan, and I went to so many of those games in your era because Troy Davis was the draw, right? Yeah. And what I remember most about you is the neck roll, right? It was like, Troy Davis is running behind Tim Kohn. That was what everybody talked about and wrote about at that time, because there wasn't much else to write about for Cyclone football at that time. But the neck roll, let's talk, because you don't see a lot of neck rolls now, but that was a thing in the 90s.
Oh my goodness! Well, the thing is, it seems now the whole emphasis is on wearing tight jerseys, small shoulder pads to really emphasize arm size
People
and things like that.
Grab
and
you too.
That too. But what we had spider pads under our shoulder pads, which were like kind of a little foam, like girdle, not girdle, kind of like a harness type of thing that elevated the shoulder pads like an extra half inch or so. And then on top of that, you get the big neck roll. The whole point is, okay, I'm 6'6", but I'm going to look like I'm 6'10".
Was that the point? You just wanted to look as massive
it was kind of like, Fletch, 6'5", 6'9" with afro. It was like just trying to build up and have like as many things to essentially, provide an intimidating visage as possible. So, I kind of bought into that a little bit too much. And in hindsight, it probably would have been better for my pass blocking if I had my shoulders, my arms a little less encumbered by all that. But at the same time, it gave me a lot of surface area, my whole shoulder pads there to really, clear a lot of space when I was run blocking. So that was, gives and takes, I guess.
What made Troy Davis great?
You know what? I mean, just indestructibility. He had tremendous instincts. He had tremendous, first, second, and third step. He might not have been the blazing guy in any kind of 40-yard dash, but number one is he used his size or lack of size as well as any running back. I mean, he absolutely disappeared behind, big guys like Patanafa and all the other, Matt Rayfelt and Doug Easley and Byron Heights and a number of other guys that we had out there. And so he was hard to pick up, I would imagine, from a defense standpoint. By the time he did, he was already past you. He was so quick and he hit holes so well. And the thing is, unlike a lot of running backs that I even see like currently, he never went backwards. Everything was always first north and then make a move, right? So he was almost never going to be caught in the backfield. And the fact that he was literally the most indestructible piece of iron. I mean, he's obviously the Rocky Balboa from Rocky IV. He's not a man.
Yes.
I saw him like take so much punishment, and I'm just like, how do you keep getting up and wanting the ball again? I mean, that's amazing.
Yeah, I watched a bunch of Troy Davis highlights last night preparing for this interview, and I'm like looking at his 40 time. I'm looking at all this stuff, and I think my one takeaway is what you just said. Like, he was just like a pinball. Nobody could ever get that guy down. He just refused to go down sometimes, and he broke so many tackles for such a small guy. And it's incredible to watch him because you don't see a lot of guys that run like him anymore.
Well, and he didn't take passing plays off either. I mean, he would flat out stone an outside linebacker or any Mike linebacker coming in. I mean, he would lower his shoulder and absolutely drop him stone cold. And I mean, that was the thing that Coach Loney in film review, he'd make sure just so that nobody would miss it. And we'd be obviously breaking down how each of us did in terms of our pass blocking assignments. Said, look at number 28. Look at number 28. Look at what he does there. I mean, he was in awe. Coach Loney, I mean, he had a pro football experience prior. He had, obviously pro football experience after. And, I mean, he was watching a guy that literally did even the little things incredibly well.
Now, with Troy Davis, the thing that always amazed me was Iowa State football was not very good at that time. I mean, this was coming out of the Walden era.
10-1 season. I mean, you want to talk about a soul-crushing experience.
Yeah. I mean, this is my childhood, right? Is like, you had some teams in the late 70s. They went to the Peach Bowl, and you had like the Kreiner era was pretty decent, and you had Johnny Majors was in the history, and there was a ton of old coaches like Jimmy Johnson and Pete Carroll. Like, these guys were on Iowa State staffs at one point. But then, like, the Walden era came in, and Jim Walden, great guy, but just didn't have a whole lot of success at Iowa State. And Iowa State was the bottom of the barrel when Dan McCarney took over. And yet they had this one guy and a good offensive line, Troy Davis, and everybody knew where the ball was going to go every play. And yet you guys were still able to gain like 200 to 300 yards on the ground against Texas and against Oklahoma and against Oklahoma State and against Nebraska. And it just, no matter who you're playing, you guys did what you wanted offensively. How were you able to do that? Like, how could some other team with more talent not just game plan against you?
Well, I mean, first off, in just acknowledging that, when we had like 35,000 fans in the stands for those games back then, that was a great day. I mean, we would obviously see sellouts for Iowa and Nebraska and what have you, but, literally the fan base was probably up 50-50 during those games. But the great thing about the fans that were there were that they found things to celebrate. They didn't have the expectations like, oh my goodness, this is our year. We're finally going to turn around and go to a bowl game.
They had the TDO meter.
The TDO meter. I mean, and the fact that, everybody got, I think, really excited. The expectations were low, but, everybody found something to celebrate, which gave us something to feel good about, too. You want to win every game, but a lot of times it also became like, how much national attention can we get Troy? Because this is in the era before you have, obviously, ubiquitous sports television where every game is broadcast.
Right.
The only games we ever got on TV was regional coverage for the Cyhawk game. That was literally the only time that we would get any kind of coverage.
Yeah, I grew up listening to the games on Saturday afternoons with Pete Taylor on the call and writing down Troy Davis's yards for every carry.
Yeah, next to Pete Taylor, John Walters is fantastic, but I miss Pete Taylor. That for me was always, and the Pete Taylor show on Sunday mornings and things like that. But you'd have actually all these teams, Big 8, Big 12 conference teams stacking 8 or even 9 in the box. And we were always the offensive line, and Steve Loney was always I think he always loved the idea of putting this to rest. We were declared a mess as an offensive line unit prior to, I think it was the 1995 season. We were written off by all the national, Iowa State's offensive line is horrible, and we actually ended up being a very good unit. We were patched together. We were a land of misfit toys, but we really kind of came together well. And we had, 8 or 9 in the box, and we had a running back that was worth at least 2 defenders, but the other guys still had to get blocked, and we put a huge amount of pride In fact, also a lot of peer pressure among ourselves to not be the guy that, has a breakdown that causes, the play to get stopped. And it was just a fantastic unit. And we lined up and said, hey, we're going to bring Troy because on 3rd and 6, he's our best bet for a conversion. It's not a pass. It's Troy Davis, off tackle left or off tackle right. And with a cutback in all likelihood. So Troy was a phenomenal back that a lot of people don't give him enough credit because what he did against the defenses he did with essentially they knew it was coming. This isn't a situation like there's any guesswork that we were going to play action somebody to death. We almost never did that. And it was in 11 games, 2,000 yards in 11 games, not a 12-game season, not a, essentially 14, 15-game season where if you're in the SEC and you play, in the championship and you go through the playoffs and stuff like that. So I think Troy deserves even, as much or more credit than he gets.
Yeah, I look at some of those highlights, and I remember watching and listening to these games as well, and it'd be like 3rd and 8, and every Cyclone fan knows the draw is coming. And I'm just thinking, like, how does the defense fall for the draw every time? It's like, it's going to, they're not dropping Todd Doxson back and throwing a post
and Todd could scramble, but I mean, it's, we had I would bet our conversion rate was about 33%.
Oh, it worked all the time. It worked all the time. You watch those Missouri games, and it's like, Missouri, he runs, I think Troy averaged like 250 yards against Missouri, for 3 years against them, and most of it was draw plays. And I just don't know how they kept falling for that.
Well, at some point, it's not a matter of falling for it. It's just going to happen. Troy was actually good enough to essentially make a broken play, go for positive yardage. And, the coaches did a good job putting him in a good position because when he was a freshman, obviously Troy wasn't utilized well by Jim Weldon's staff. I mean, he had flashes of brilliance, but, didn't really have a chance to really stand out. Dan McCarney and Steve Loney really built the offense to showcase and highlight Troy. And, my goodness, that was astonishingly, well conceived.
So you go from not playing football as a high school sophomore to essentially 6 years later, you are an NFL draft pick in the 3rd round. And there hasn't been a whole lot of Iowa State NFL draft picks. We just ended a long drought with, David Montgomery and Butler, last couple of years, Lazard as well. But prior to that, there had, I don't know, 20 years. It had been a long time.
Well, I mean, prior to me, Gene Williams, not too long before, was, I think, a 4th-round pick. And Keith Sims, I think, might have been like a 3rd-round pick before. But those were, big standout offensive linemen.
And there was Robertson, too.
Yeah, Marcus
Robertson, who had a long career as a safety in the NFL, mostly with, like, the Oilers and Titans, I think.
Yeah, he's a stud.
But even in the 3rd round, like, you're probably one of the 5 or 6 highest drafted players in Iowa State football history. What was that process like to get drafted by, the Oakland Raiders? And these are Al Davis's Oakland Raiders, too.
You see, my wife is smiling because the entire draft experience was a story. So this is 1997. I'm in Ames, and I'm projected to be somewhere between the 3rd and the 7th round. 3rd round optimistic, 7th round, there were 2 teams that had me not on their draft board, which were the 2 teams that ended up going to the Super Bowl the following year. So what do they know? So at that time, the first 2 rounds were on ESPN, and the next rounds were on ESPN2. The problem is, being in Ames, the cable system only had ESPN1. There was no ESPN2 on the cable system. So knowing full well that I probably wasn't going to be an ESPN draft call, I had to figure out, okay, well, how am I going to monitor things? How am I going to, stay informed? Because I had a brick of a cell phone that I rented for 1 month. We used to be able to rent cell phones for 1 month periods, and this thing was just literally, it looked like a brick. It was rectangular and heavy and
Zach Morris style.
It was one of those things where I only gave out the number to my agent so he could give out to like the front offices of various NFL teams, gave out to a couple of family members. And I might have mistakenly given it to a couple of teammates, which was a mistake. And I'll reveal why later. So where do we watch this? Well, we decided that the only place on campus that had ESPN2 that was accessible to us was actually in Hilton Coliseum. Tim Floyd volunteered his office for us to go watch the draft there. And, the big screen TV that he had in that office in there. So we go in there, and we're just kind of settling in. I'm nervous as heck. I'm actually watching my cell phone, willing it to ring. And just as things are kind of getting started with the 3rd round, well, that's when we hear it. Kiss concert starts up right next to us. Kiss Army has already descended on Hilton Coliseum. Now the music is starting to pound through the walls, and you can barely hear anything. And my phone rings, and it's my agent, and he says, Tim, I just heard from a buddy in Texas. Dallas says that, at the third round, you're next on their draft list. And Dallas, I think, drafted something like 89th overall, third round. So I'm thrilled to death. I'm like, oh my goodness, that's Troy Aikman. That's, Emmitt Smith. That's,
the Cowboys were
Super
the
Bowl
team of the
glory.
90s.
Yeah. And Hudson Houck was the offensive line coach who was like a great offensive line coach. So I thought my development continues. I was still, kind of a raw project in my view. And so I'm excited as heck. I'm just watching every of the draft picks come in, waiting for that call. And then the phone does ring. And it's a woman's voice, which kind of threw me off because at the time there weren't too many women working in the NFL front office roles and whatnot. So it's a woman's voice says, hello, is this Tim Kohn? I'm like, yeah. I said, congratulations, you've been drafted by the Oakland Raiders. Now there's about a 10-second bit of calculus going on in my brain at this point because the Oakland Raiders were one of only a handful of teams that never talked to me once during the entire pre-draft process. They never worked me out. They never interviewed me. They never even talked to my agent about me. There was absolutely no indication that they ever had any interest. So I immediately called BS on this. And I said, you know what? Tell Doug, meaning Doug Easley, who I thought was actually calling me, tell Doug it's not cool to have his girlfriend call up and pretend to be from the Oakland Raiders. And she's like, no, I don't know who Doug is. Hold on for Coach Bugle. I'm like, okay. And next voice I hear, is this Tim Kohn? I'm like, oh my goodness, that sounds like Coach Bugle. I'm like, yes, Coach. I understand you're quite a character. I'm like, oh my goodness, no. Yeah, Coach. Thanks. I'm excited to be a Raider. And I don't even remember what I was saying at that point. I'm just thinking, what a fantastic first impression I just made on this coach. And Joe Bugle's one of Steve Loney's favorites. I think coached him previously or worked with him in some capacity. So,
do you think that had a big impact in them taking you?
No, and I'll tell you why. Because I think I found out the backstory, at least the alleged backstory, how I got drafted. Because the Raiders, by all accounts, should never have drafted me. Earlier in that same third round, they drafted my clone from Nebraska, Adam True, who was 6'5", 320 pounds. He was a long snapper, but he was a tackle, and I was a tackle. The rumor was that he had heard that Jerry Jones wanted to draft me, and he drafted me to spite him. That was literally what I heard from people around the program. The motivations behind why Al Davis made a draft pick were often very cryptic, and they were often personal. They weren't necessarily based on, he drafts a kicker in the first round just to prove he can, right? A lot of times it's just to be outrageous and to, essentially, coaches would say that they had no input on the draft process. They actually would go into Al Davis's office and try to pitch a player that they were interested in, hoping that would resonate with him and that that would actually come to pass on draft day.
So essentially, you get to Oakland, there's no spot for you because they took your spot.
I'm a redheaded stepchild. I'm like the 12th offensive lineman on this team. So it was a little bit of a tough spot in that capacity. But the other thing that was bad about that draft day experience was that Joe Bugle basically says to me, well, we're looking forward to seeing you during minicamp on May 3rd to May 5th. I'm like, oh, that's bad news. My agent had checked with every team that was interested with me when their minicamps were so that Shannon, my wife, and I could set our wedding.
Oh.
So literally the one weekend we chose that we thought was in the clear was May 3rd, May 4th. And that's when minicamp
That's
occurred.
your introduction to the NFL.
So I hear that, and I'm just like, oh, I don't think Shannon's going to take this well. So on the happiest day of my professional life up to that point, my fiance is bawling her eyes out. She is so upset. I'm thinking, some perspective, we could probably afford to upgrade our wedding now. Drafted third round, some money's coming in. So the Raiders actually, when working with my agent, worked out a little bit of an accommodation. I came in early, did all the physicals and orientation stuff early, did massive, taking every rep all through Friday night, took a red-eye flight Friday night back to Iowa, stopped in Chicago because it was an overnight flight. I think I met my agent in Chicago for breakfast at 6 a.m., got into Des Moines at 9 a.m., got to the tux shop at 10, picked up my tux. I'm dehydrated. I've got weird tan lines from wearing a helmet, and I looked like a wreck. I missed the rehearsal dinner. My brother stepped in for me during the rehearsal dinner. So I'm at the actual wedding, and I don't even know what to do, where to be, where to stand.
Right.
And Coach Loney's in the pews, And I'm just thinking he's grading me. He's absolutely breaking down what I'm doing wrong here. He's going to come back and say, I had to give you a minus on this one, Timothy. It's just like, and he was actually really great and gracious afterwards because, I think, he was I told him about what I was thinking at the time, and I think he laughed about it. But, so, the whole draft day experience was surreal, and it was wild, and I was actually upset because even afterwards I was looking for an Oakland Raiders hat anywhere in sporting goods stores in Des Moines, and I couldn't find one. I wanted to wear a hat or something from the team I'd just been drafted by.
That's great. What was your first encounter with Al Davis like? I mean, you mentioned earlier how interesting of a guy this was, and for anybody that's followed the NFL through the years, Al Davis, he's kind of on like the Mount Rushmore of NFL characters ever. Him and Jerry Jones are probably the two most famous owners of all time. I mean, Robert Kraft's kind of creeped in that discussion over the last 20 years. But really, the first 30, 40 years of the NFL, it was all Al Davis and the Raiders. And he has run, or his fingerprints have been all over that franchise, probably more so than anyone else with the exception maybe of Jerry Jones. But even Jerry Jones is kind of like post-1990s.
Well, and Jerry Jones wasn't with the Cowboys from the very beginning.
Right.
Al Davis, pretty much, from the get-go, and he's always been very maverick. I kind of think that when I watched that movie Semi-Pro with Will Ferrell, that he's kind of like the Jackie Moon of, the NFL.
Yeah, Al Davis probably
promotion.
Thought he could have been playing at one time, right?
Oh, well, and the thing is, he would, and you asked what, one of my earliest impressions is that he was at almost every practice. And when he was at practice, all of a sudden the hitting got crisp. Guys started really. Nobody was fooled. Al Davis watched almost every minute of practice film too, so nothing escaped him. He was actually as involved as any person that you would see outside of the actual coaching staff. And then he'd come down to the field typically on hitting days. He'd come watch practice, and then everybody had to step up their effort level, as if that fooled his eyes, but. He'd actually come up and occasionally he would work with me on pass pro technique. Like, hey, Tim, try put your hands this way. Would he know
what he was talking about?
Yeah, as much as anybody. Granted, pass protection had evolved a lot since the 60s, but, I think that he just really enjoyed the coaching process and couldn't tear himself away. Every phase of operating the Raiders, including, I dare say, probably even our road trips and our travel, was, all... I think Al had a heavy amount of influence to it, and for the most part for the better. A lot of people, cast aspersions or essentially look at some of the things that happened later on, being a little bit erratic or eccentric, and that's kind of his prerogative. He built the team to where it was. Obviously, built Super Bowl winning teams, built a mystique around it. A lot of players wanted to be a Raider, even when being a Raider wasn't a great thing. It just had a kind of a brand.
Yeah, even in the 90s, that was right after Bo Jackson, right?
Oh, my goodness,
the Raiders with Howie Long and Bo Jackson.
Steve Wisniewski.
Yeah, exactly.
Steve Wisniewski was I backed up Steve Wisniewski for my 3 years there, and it's to the Raiders' great benefit that he was never hurt, because I was not an upgrade on Steve Wisniewski. He was I think 8, 9-time Pro Bowl, should be in the Hall of Fame, was the dirtiest player in the NFL several years in a row, yet I never heard him say a 4-letter word in my presence during my entire time in Oakland. So he became like a surrogate older brother, and he was good friends with like Howie Long, who had left before I got there. Bo Jackson, would tell stories. What a consummate class act Bo Jackson is in every sense. You don't begrudge him a thing. You just lament the fact that we didn't get more of him,
right.
From a baseball and a football standpoint. So, from that, and that team at the time still had like Tim Brown, Hall of Famer. You had Chester McLaughlin, Russell Maryland was on the team. We had a lot of other Super Bowl MVPs like Desmond Howard and Larry Brown, a couple things like that. The coaching staff, you had the Hall of Famers in the coaching staff, and Freddie Blitnikoff and Willie Brown. It was an interesting experience if you were just a football fan to be in that Raiders locker room.
Yeah, I remember a couple of years ago the Raiders were on Hard Knocks. When Gruden came back to the Raiders, they were on Hard Knocks. And Mark Davis at the time, Al's son, who is owning and running the team right now, they would have these banquets for former Raiders, where all basically former Raiders were kind of invited back, and they do these celebrations, and it's kind of like an alumni thing that you see mostly at colleges. And it struck me how proud these former players were of being a Raider, because there's one thing, and you alluded to it earlier, of how the Raider mystique and Al Davis have been portrayed in the media over the last 20 years of, the game has passed them by. They need to update things, and some of that may be true. But I think there's a lot to be said about loyalty and about treating their own really well. And I think that came across really well in the Hard Knocks series.
I have a hard time watching a lot of pro football. Just including things like that. Even though Coach Gruden still has a soft spot in my heart, it's he's just a fantastic. He was a fantastic coach, the type of coach that I would throw myself on a landmine for, back in the day. And so I was glad to see. I saw that as a really encouraging thing for him to come back to the Raiders, and he's obviously having to, reformulate some things, make a lot of sweeping moves, and it is something where Raiders have a lot of pride in being former Raiders. And I had a brief stint, with the Broncos, and went back to the Raiders, and even if it wasn't a great situation, the Raiders hadn't quite turned the corner. It was still a lot of fun, and it was an incredibly unique cast of characters there.
How do you view your time in the NFL now? Because you've spent way more time, as a financial guy, post-NFL career, but, somebody sees you walking down the road, you're a big man, and they think, oh, a football player, and immediately they think, they want to hear football stories more than, like, what's the small cap market doing?
That's the funny thing is that, looking kind of like, I look like a Shrek stunt double, so if I'm wearing a suit and I'm going into any kind of a financial meeting or doing any type of like a presentation on, the state of the global economy or global markets or what have you, they're looking at me thinking, weren't you bouncing outside a nightclub or something earlier before? So it kind of dents my credibility from the get-go. Usually I have to do a fair amount of talking before people think, maybe he has taken, single-digit blows to the head, and my pro football experience was 3 years. So from high school to college to pro, literally 1990 to 2000, one solid decade was football. That was a theme and a chapter in my life. And I really hesitate to consider what life would have been like without it, and at every level, because high school football really kind of gave me a purpose I wasn't feeling in any other sport or any other activity. College football, Iowa State was by far not my first choice. I was a Big Ten guy, but I shudder to think what my life would be like without my Iowa State experience. I mean, it made such an impression that even though I moved around a ton as a kid, Ames feels more like a hometown than any other place, in the country. And so I'm in Ankeny now. I'm within, thankfully a half hour's drive of getting Great Plains Pizza or Hickory Park or whatever else, and pro football led to some transformative changes too, because actually college is where I met my wife, and where the fruit of that tree in terms of my kids and every other thing that's been good in my life since has been because of that decision to come to Iowa State. To go to Oakland was not necessarily in my best interest as a professional football player, because the opportunities, and I dare say at the position level, the coaching wasn't there to necessarily perhaps make me. Ollie Ross went to the Dallas Cowboys the year after I did. He was my understudy at Iowa State, good player. He became a great player with the right coaching, with Hudson Houck actually coaching down in Dallas, and ended up making some very nice paydays at Pittsburgh and other places like that. I don't begrudge it, because even though I had very much a journeyman experience in Oakland, that was just kind of an extension of my development. Actually, that's where I became a Christian as well, surrounded by some great, powerful Christian men, and so it was every stage was a transformative step, and then being released from the Raiders and trying to figure out what's next in life at age 27. Usually, most people post college, they've made 3, 4, 5 years headway into their next act, their next career. I had to totally figure out what I was actually interested in, what I was going to do, and the most crippling thing for some people, and I think I fall into this category, in professional sports is to be there long enough that you have enough financial stability that you really have no incentive to push through adversity at any later point. And so we were scrappy. We were hungry. We did not spend extravagantly. Shannon would be the first one to tell you. We lived very lean and meagerly. I mean, even as professional football players, I drove a Honda Accord. We lived in a townhouse next to a prison. We did things to conserve. We would specifically plan our date nights based on value menus. I mean, that was that kind of experience back then, because we were very concerned about starting a family and making sure that we had enough. And that was a really great formative experience, because it gave us the discipline to appreciate what we had and to essentially build things the right way, and to understand that everything had to be earned, which has been my experience ever since.
I've seen that you claim to read 90 books a year, which, that's 7, 8 a month. not calling BS on it. I'm just saying it's a claim that's out there. First of all, is that true?
I'm actually going to defer to Shannon. Shannon, is that true? Easily.
90 books a year.
I'm only at 52 so far this year.
You got some work to do. So,
COVID actually kind of threw me off, to be honest. Not because of having COVID, but just it was so disquieting. It was hard to concentrate on things for many months there.
You're probably traveling less, and you can get a lot of reading done on planes.
That's a big thing too. Is that when you're in a plane and you're really not able to do a whole lot more, but you get a lot of reading done there or in hotels. So that did kind of crimp my style a bit. But I read over 100 books last year, and usually around 60 or 70 is usually my going average.
Sweet spot. What's your favorite non-fiction book? Oh, excuse me, not nonfiction. What's your favorite fiction book? Because from what I've read, you like to read a lot of nonfiction.
Yeah.
So what's your favorite fiction book?
It really depends on genre. I like a lot of science fiction, but Count of Monte Cristo is one of my favorite books. If we're talking about
the
classics.
ultimate revenge tale.
So intricately. And you watch the movie, and I watched the movie before I ever read the book, and you read the book, and there's a depth there that you just never are going to really pick up on otherwise. One of the best science fiction books that really still kind of haunts me to this day is a fairly recent one. It's the Three-Body Problem by, I believe the name is Cixin Liu. Chinese author, was translated, I think about 10 years ago into English, and the trilogy is just mind-blowing in terms of, getting a sense of not just, physics, but also, the implications of, do we really want to make contact with an alien species and things like that. And it's just really artfully done, and also really captures a lot of human elements in a way that I've not seen in literature before. So, and a lot of geeks and nerds like Dune, and I think Dune is a fantastic book, and I'm kind of excited.
Yeah, new movie coming out.
Yeah, I'm hoping that goes well.
So, if you're reading 100 books a year, are you reading multiple books at once? Because you mentioned Count of Monte Cristo. Count of Monte Cristo, that's no weekend read there. That's going to take a while to get through, especially with as you want to take your time with Count of Monte Cristo because there's a lot to it there. A lot of time in Chateau d'If,
Well, and that's actually a really good point because I kind of have a short attention span. I can read a book for maybe about 3 or 4 pages at a time, and I kind of have to take a break. I can't just keep plowing through it, or at least very seldom. I'd say the mix of books that I read, probably 1/3 of them are audiobooks. So I listened when I would drive when I was traveling, or when I'm on the treadmill, listen to a lot of books. I would read a lot of books on Kindle. I've got about 9 active on Kindle that I kind of, flip back and forth. And sometimes, that actually helps me. I read 3 or 4 pages here, flip to another one, and it just kind of keeps my mind nimble. It keeps me from actually starting to skim. I want to make sure that I'm spending some time consolidating what I'm reading. And then usually when I'm traveling, I have about 3 or 4 physical books with me. And it just because my moods change, and if I'm not in the mood to read something, I'll have a hard time reading what I'm not in the mood for.
Another one of your Twitter themes that I enjoy is cheat day. So, anybody that has tried to watch their diet through the years, everybody knows you got to build in a cheat day at some point. You're a big man. You've had periods of your life where you had to put on weight, so I'm sure you became an expert at cheat day. At this point in your life, what's your go-to cheat day?
Well, first off, I probably should give a bit of an attribution here because this idea really was brought to light to me by Tim Ferriss's book, 4 Hour Body. And a lot of what's in that book, for all the grief he gets as being, some type of influencer type of guy, he did his homework, and a lot of the stuff in that book is very accurate, including the stuff when he talks about how to improve at NFL drills. He actually has a good Pareto approach. This is how you improve in these areas. And one of the things he focused on was eating low carb for 6 days a week, and then giving yourself a reset, a cheat day. And so for me, cheat day usually starts off with, and I think I've even posted occasionally, usually some kind of a big breakfast because I love breakfast food. And I 6 days a week I'm doing kind of intermittent fasting, and then when I do eat, usually I try to stay low carb, although I've kind of maintained and given myself a little bit more leeway with COVID and whatnot. But cheat day starts with a big breakfast, usually a lot of pancakes, donuts. The best thing I love is Costco blueberry muffins. Slice them up, griddle them, get them all kind of caramelized brown, put about 3 of those in a bowl, and then heap vanilla ice cream on it. Breakfast of champions. And,
ice cream for breakfast then?
Oh, why not?
Yep.
Gosh,
I'm not judging.
We put milk on cereal. This is, so it's just... But usually then midday is something pizza related, and if I can find an excuse to go up to Ames to get Great Plains, that's what I do. I'm a big fan of Lou Malnati's, so I've got some Lou Malnati's pizzas in the fridge and whatnot. And then dinner is usually I concede whatever Shannon is of a mood to eat. We'll go get some Tex-Mex or something like that. So and I usually will snack on donuts and things like that between meals, just to keep my blood sugar from dipping.
So you go hard.
Oh man, probably. I think I saw a post about The Rock's cheat day, something like 7,700 calories. I'm thinking, I'd clear that before noon on cheat day.
Well, I actually saw a picture of you recently on Twitter with The Rock.
That was, 20 years ago. Russell Maryland set that up. Russell Maryland was a teammate in Oakland, and he was Dwayne Johnson's mentor at University of Miami.
Oh, that's right. Those are both Miami guys.
So that hookup got us in backstage in San Jose in 1999. And The Rock and all the other guys were great. It was funny because everybody was signing each other's autographs. Like the pro wrestlers, like, oh my goodness, these are real athletes, and we're like, oh, these are wrestlers. These are the bigger than life characters that we wish we were. And so like I had a few pictures with like the Big Show, The Rock, and like the Dudley Boys and things like that, and all these other like.
Does The Rock have your autograph?
No. But no, I mean he was actually really gracious, really cool guy, and they set us up with tickets like ringside. And he had a match against Triple H. He was supposed to go up against Stone Cold Steve Austin, but he just cracked his neck, had a neck injury, so Triple H was a fill-in. And he throws Triple H onto our laps, and we're all like fake pounding on him and everything. Oh, wait, no, it's totally real. We were really pounding on him. And the funniest thing is afterwards, Rock gets the microphone, and he starts roasting every single one of us. I mean, he had everybody's names. By the way, for anybody who follows me on Twitter, that's Hank in the background. That's Hank the Wonder Dog. No, it was a really fun experience, and I mean, they were class guys, and you kind of wonder what these guys were like in real life, and they're actually it's a locker room mentality like you'd see anywhere else.
Right. So the way we end every episode of the Moonlight Graham Show, Tim, is with the 5 big questions. First big question is, who's your all-time favorite teammate?
Steve Wisniewski, Oakland Raiders.
Now, you mentioned him earlier, but you had, 3 years with Oakland.
Yeah. There.
What made Steve Wisniewski so important?
He's probably one of the more underrated offensive linemen that are out there. When you're an Oakland Raider, your brand is tarnished. The press and everybody else is going to think, hey, you're some kind of barely reformed parolee,
right.
To some extent. And
they created that moniker. They like that, though, I feel like.
Pat Harlow, who came over from the New England Patriots, said, I never got a personal foul my entire career. My first year as a Raider, I get 6. I haven't changed. My uniform changed,
Sure.
So there was also a bit of a perception and a branding there, but one of the most genuine, great guys. And you know what? I was just a scared, kind of intimidated rookie, took me under his wing, actually taught me a lot about how not just to be a professional football player, but really how to be, a man, an upstanding man in this business. When you can make a lot of choices to be a lot of different types of people, and you get all kinds of press coverage on how that spectrum runs, the guys that never get talked about are the guys who are the quintessential class acts, and that's not a bad thing. If nobody knows you for what you do off the field, then you're probably doing things right.
You mentioned you became a Christian while out in Oakland.
And that was largely because of Steve as well.
That's what I was wondering.
Yeah. And Steve's, devout, great man of God. The funny thing is, I was starting to come around to, acknowledging, God's role in my life. And he was the right guy at the right time for a lot of things for me. And I mean, it's one of those things where, as much as anything, my being in Oakland was not an accident. It was not something that I should, lament in terms of, hey, what might have been with my football career had I gone to a different set of circumstances. And I think everything happens for a reason. And even with my knees and back and everything else that aches right now, there's nothing that I would change for fear of what else it might unravel.
I think the knees and back, they probably hurt more from those treadmills than your football career. But
I'm hurting the treadmills worse. I think they're getting the worst end of that.
When you look back on your football career now, what's one memory or one play or one game that reminds you of everything that you love about the game of football?
When I think about playing football, and you have that Oakland Raiders experience, and that was actually still pretty limited. But when I think about what gets me excited to play football, it's not doing it on a pro stage, it's doing it on a college stage. And when I had either dreams about playing football or dreams about coming back and playing football, I actually had more dreams about finding out I had an extra year of eligibility and coming back to play for the Cyclones than I did for, oh my goodness, you got re-signed by the Raiders. And so the whole Iowa State atmosphere, and especially what it's become, is by far what I think about when I think about football. And I mean, you could actually point to a lot of things that had to do with Troy Davis as being like the Missouri game. I mean, that was singular in my mind. And
the last one
where he ran for 378 yards. And
the one at home.
Yeah,
the junior, that was his junior year.
That was a fun
sophomore year.
That was a fun game because Lee Corso, before the game, his son was a reserve linebacker for Missouri at the time, and Lee Corso on his show said, Missouri-Iowa State matchup. I'm giving Iowa State the evil eye. Troy Davis will have under 100 yards in this game. He gets 378 yards. That was a lot of fun, even though that was only one of 2 victories we had the entire year. So, just most of my best memories are all going to be Iowa State linked, including, the coaching staff and a lot of the players and great friends there. I mean, too many to single out, really.
I was at that Missouri game. I was at that, and I remember watching the TDO meter was going crazy that game. That was so much fun.
Those guys got tired. I think they were wearing out the cardboard there. So,
what still nags at you from your career, outside of the injuries?
Well, I mean, the injuries are going to come. Nobody plays football naively thinking that they're not going to have some dings and scratches, if not, a limp. One thing you do worry about is the cognitive issues. I guess what nags at me. It's one of those things where you kind of want to leave on a good note. And I mean, it was something where I was, my last game I was on the active roster. It was Y2K, which is actually an interesting story in and of itself, but maybe for a follow-up. And I mean, it's something where you'd kind of like to see more of the pro career, develop into something that you could be proud of. And in a way, I've kind of taken a perverse delight in my mediocrity from that standpoint. In the same way that, you hear like Bob Uecker or, maybe not as modestly as a Moonlight Graham, for example, might be. But it's something where, like I said, I really can't have too many regrets because so much else in my life is so just absolutely unjustifiably good. And who am I to complain?
You've done a lot of name dropping here. Some of it has been brought on by me, but have you ever been starstruck by anyone that you've met?
From a football standpoint, actually, no. That's the funny thing is that you kind of become accustomed to seeing people who are famous who are on TV and realizing that they're human beings. So that kind of gets demystified a little bit, right off the bat. I guess one thing that was kind of cool was that I always grew up a Packer fan, and getting to play in Lambeau Field was kind of a cool moment. And that was when Brett Favre was at his peak, and Reggie White and everybody else was there. And, being able to kneel in the prayer circle that Reggie White was, I couldn't even hear Reggie, because it was just still kind of loud and stuff like that. But I could only pick out, little bits here and there. But, essentially Raiders and Packers come together at the center of the field to pray at the center of the field. And with the Minister of Defense, I mean, I would have liked to actually have met him because he was a hero of mine growing up as a Packer fan. And, that certainly I would have liked to have been able to say, yeah, I got my butt kicked by Reggie White. But he was out way before I went into that game as an exhibition game. So, yeah, I mean, gosh, I even forgot the question.
Well, starstruck. Maybe not. Maybe outside of football.
Outside of football, actually, when I meet people that I respect, that actually I know now on Twitter, as a matter of fact, but people who are heroes from an investment standpoint. Actually, had a chance to meet Cliff Asness, which it's not going to mean a lot to a whole lot of folks outside of like financial Twitter, but. Met him at a conference, and I mean, always, the intellectual horsepower that guy brings to bear is always. I respect great intellects, which is why whenever I get a follow back from any of those folks, I'm like, oh my goodness, now I have to be on good behavior. I'm going to totally jackass my way out of their good favor on this. And I mean, there's so many brilliant investment minds on Twitter that I've developed relationships with that I never would have otherwise. And I'm in a virtual sense, starstruck by most of those folks and. By the handful of people that are still foolish enough to follow me and interact with me, I guess. So,
what's the best advice you've ever received, Tim?
I don't know if it's advice I've received as much as it's just something I figured out. And that is, don't set goals. Just make a promise to yourself to keep getting incrementally better day in and day out, and you'll be stunned at how far it'll take you. And in case in point, I had no expectations about being a football player when I tried out for my junior year. It was just something I wanted to do for myself. It didn't matter to me what my bench was or what my squat was compared to anybody else. It just mattered that I got a little bit better. And I found that the more I just focused on those things, all of a sudden I'd pick my head up and realize look where I'm at. And now all of a sudden I'm in a position to be, a college football player, maybe get a scholarship. And it's all those things that you can get bogged down in long-term goals. The best thing to do is create a process, create a system of constant improvement, and let the goals rack up, even before you've actually would otherwise set out for them.
I like that a lot, and obviously you're a great example of that. Has that same mindset worked in your post NFL life?
Absolutely. That's part of what reading 100 books in a year.
Yeah, because you talk. It's easy to make that when it's like I'm 6'6", weigh 170 pounds, and I need to put on the weight and I need to eat. But a lot of times, your post NFL, it's not as clear of a path, right? Post playing days, and I think that's why so many athletes struggle, because we can watch TV or we can know as an athlete like what it takes to get to where we want to go, and some of that is inherent. You get in shape and you do things, you follow it, but everybody has a different career path outside of sports, and sometimes those incremental improvements are more difficult to gauge.
I had a teammate in Denver who was a great guy, starting offensive lineman, just really fantastic in every way. He was getting banged up, and he was prematurely going to probably be ending his career. Been making decent money, but probably didn't make enough to see him all the way through. And so here's a guy who's probably going to have a 7-year career, have enough money that he's okay, but it's definitely not as secure a situation as he would like. And I remember I was about 4 years out of football, starting to actually make progress in my career. And I started right after football in a $30,000 a year entry level job in a cubicle. Not too many football players are willing to kind of make
right.
that transition, or they would view that as a nightmare. And this teammate of mine, 4 years later, now that my career is actually making some progress, it's like, how did you do it? How did you make that transition? Because I'm realizing my time is limited, and I'm going to be, essentially looking for something else to do, and I'm not sure what I want to do. And that's the conundrum for pro athletes. The worst curse is to have an intermediate career. Have boom or bust is better than the intermediate career,
right.
where you have 7 years or 8 years, you've got a little bit of money but not enough, and you also are now trying to reinvent yourself in your 30s, and you're not sure what you're interested in because you're out of school for maybe close to 10 years, and maybe when you were in school you weren't paying very close attention. So, it's one of those things where, post-football, being incremental, keeping your head down, reading is one way that I can at least get second-hand or third-hand experience I can't get firsthand, and try to incorporate that. So just dedicating yourself to constant improvement where you can. I've got no illusions that I'm going to set any bench press records. My joints are too messed up, but my brain still works for now, so I'm going to try to use it up while I've got the faculty.
Well, Tim, thank you so much for joining the Moonlight Graham Show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
And opening your house to me. This is great.
Oh, actually, you made it easy for me as opposed to, going over to West Des Moines. So.
Hey guys, thanks once again to listening to today's episode of the Moonlight Graham Show. And even though I do most of the interviews here on the podcast, there is a ton of work that happens behind the scenes that you guys don't see that make each episode possible. So I got to give a shout out to the Moonlight Graham Show team. First of all, Brian Sandvig, our producer. Brian does all of the post-production work, and in real life, he's not just a podcast producer, he's also a real estate agent. So if you're looking to buy or sell a home down in the Kansas or Missouri areas, give Brian Sandvig a call. Next guy on that list is Brendan Gargano. Brendan does all of our design and artwork here on the podcast. He's one of the most talented artists I've ever met, and I love all of his work. If you need any help on the design side with logos or anything like that, give Brendan Gargano a call. The next guy on that list is Andy Flattery, my older brother. Andy, of course, has done some of the interviews here on the podcast. He also is a certified financial planner. He owns a business called Simple Wealth Planning. If you need any help in that area, check Andy Flattery out. And then, of course, the trusty co-host Tom Griffin and my younger brother Neil Flattery. Those guys are just busy being husbands, being fathers, they're family men, but also they do a ton of work here on the show. So thanks again for listening. We really appreciate you guys subscribing and supporting the Moonlight Graham Show.